So Travis is going to present on our permanent base adjustment, our AEL. Travis?
Thank you, Toby. Good evening, Mayor, Council. The item before you tonight is permanent base adjustment. And to put it in the simplest terms, a permanent base adjustment is an adjustment to the city's spending limit that's set by the state. The reason why we're looking at a permanent base adjustment is mainly just to align that limit more so with our growth and how the city's kind of what it's become and moving forward. So let me, before I really get into this, let me give you a little background on how we kind of arrived here. So this, the spending limit that I mentioned, the state set spending limit, this was the law that kind of made it happen, originated back in 1979, 1980. State legislature came together and said, you know what, we should probably look at putting some limitations on the spending for all cities, towns, and county governments. So they did implement this law, and some of the items that are associated with it is a spending limit on cities, towns, and counties, as I mentioned. But that limit, it was set at that time. So 1980, that limit was set, and then it adjusts each year a little bit for inflation and also population growth. I should also mention that this limit can only be adjusted permanently to a different level by going to the voters. So that's an aspect of what we're talking about tonight, is getting permission to move this forward and let the voters determine if the spending limit should be adjusted. Another important item to mention is now Robert, our finance director, he's worked really hard to make sure we don't exceed that spending limit. We have a lot going on, so it is a bit of a challenge, but he's made sure, and he continues to make sure we don't exceed that, because one of the aspects of it, if you do go beyond the spending limit, there are penalties associated. So the state will start looking at your revenue, your state shared revenue, and start pulling some of that back. So, but again, as I stated, Robert's done a fantastic job tracking this and making sure we don't exceed it. The other thing important to note, now keep this in mind, there are some exemptions to what goes into or impacts that spending limit. Loans and also grants are totally exempt. So those are important things, and make note of that, and we'll talk a little bit more later. Now this slide, I want to spend some extra time on this slide, because I think this is an important slide and really kind of telling you why we need to, why we're bringing this forward. So what I'm showing you here is the formula that determines what our expenditure limit is, or our spending limit. What you can see is that top number that's listed as the base, $5,493 and $533. So $5,493,533. That is our base. So that number was set in when we became a city in '84. They said that's what it takes to run a city, if you can believe that. It's a lot higher now. But each year, they add a little bit on as your population grows. So they find out what the population growth is, and then they add a little bit more for inflation. So they multiply that all together, and then you get your expenditure limit, which now is $60,178,831. So that's how you arrive at this. Now, the reason it's important, I wanted to spend a little extra time on it, is because this formula would work perfect if all we did is added more people and added a little bit of inflation. The formula will work perfect. The reason it doesn't work perfect is the cities don't grow like that. They actually, one of the things that they found out is, as you started adding things like technology, you get computer departments, brand new departments. So a lot of the cities started seeing problems, I think, right around the early 90s. They started bumping up against these expenditure limits because you're adding things that aren't being accounted for. Hence, if you add something like a brand new water company, there's nothing in our base that accounts for that. So that's kind of the challenge that you start to face as you start to push up against these spending limits. So the next slide kind of lays out the expended limit versus some of our expenses. And I wanted Robert to kind of chime in here a little bit and give us a little more detail on this. Robert, if you don't mind, can you speak to this slide?
Yeah, not a problem, Travis. So the small bar graph on the left there, kind of in the orangish color, that is our expenditure limitation for the last year that was just over $60 million. On the right, you see the bar graph of all of our different departments and cost centers and capital improvement projects, and we have about $130 million in expenditures. So this is where it kind of gets into Travis alluded to grants, debt service, and other things are excludable from the cap. So we make $130 million of expenses fit into a $60 million cap. But that does not go without a lot of planning and forethought into what type of expenses we're doing, like going after grants, as Travis talked about before.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it. And as Robert mentioned, a big piece of that, as you start to exceed that cap, we're going to always go after grants, but loans are excludable. So as you know, we have had to go out and take out loans and bonds to kind of make sure we could get everything done, but still manage it within that spending cap with those exclusions. So what are we going to do? What are the options? What are the solutions? How do we move forward? So of course, in the short term, we're going to continue to go after grants. We'll always do that. The challenge with grants is the timing can, sometimes, it may not align with our budget cycles. And then also grants, you never know whether you're going to get them or not. So you can't necessarily plan your expenditure cap based on grants. Loans, we can continue to take out loans. It's definitely an option. We've done it in the past, but the challenge is always you got to pay the interest rate on a loan. Now, we were very successful in this previous time. We went out and got a loan to make sure we're under the cap. We kind of managed that in a way where we invested it in treasury notes to kind of offset some of those borrowing costs. But I don't think the economic climate is going to be that way for a long time where you can get those high rates on those T-bills to offset those costs. But it is definitely an option and something we'll continue to consider in the short term. Now, long term, of course, the option to do, you can do a permanent base adjustment to kind of address this, and then you move your spending limit up to align with what your actual revenues are and what you agree to in the budget. Or you can do the home rule option. And I'll talk a little bit about the home rule option. This is on future slides.
Hey, Travis?
Yes.
Could I just talk a little bit about that loan option? Because we did that this past year, right? So, when you're talking to your constituents about this issue, permanent based adjustment, expenditure limitations, sounds very bureaucratic and boring, and most people are going to be like, why are we even talking about this? Well, the reality is, probably in your world, you'd compare it to what's in your savings account versus borrowing money. So if someone had $5 million in their bank account and they wanted to build a performing arts center or fix a road or bring on a new set of circumstances, whatever that program may be. So let's just you'd build a new road versus build a performing arts center versus remodeling existing facilities. You can take $5 million out of your savings account, or you can go borrow when you have the $5 million in your savings. So you'll pay an extra $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in interest. That's what we're currently doing. And we can do that forever. And that's what some bigger cities have decided it's cost of doing business. If the voters don't want to approve the city spending the money out of its savings account, well, then the cost of doing business, because you may elect to build a new performing arts center, you may elect to build a new road, and then you can decide to borrow that money. So it's not the best prudent fiscal management, right, when we're basically paying maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in interest on a project that we could simply take the money out of our savings account. So we can't do it, and we won't be able to do it next year. And we see this problem moving forward in perpetuity. The city is growing. We've grown our general fund reserve to the highest it's ever been in the city's history, some $40 million, and growing. You'll see in the audit later tonight that we added another $2.5 million to our reserves. And so for you as council members, you might say to Robert, well, let's budget for that. Let's get that done. He's going to tell you, we're bumping up an expenditure limitation. We can add the project, but with this limitation, the only way around it is we must borrow. So that's what we'll be bringing to you in May. We can't design our budget just assuming the voters will pass this. We're going to design a budget assuming the voters will not pass this and that we will in fact be borrowing. And I don't say that to scare anyone or create conflict. It's just simply the fact that, we're creating a general fund reserve. We work really hard to bring in economic development and people spend money in our community hoping to have good roads and good facilities, not necessarily thinking that that money can't be spent on the projects that the council would like to see in the budget. So that's the reality of where we're at. And I know Travis didn't want to oversell that issue, but I think we just have to understand there is a way around it, and it's simply borrowing our way out of it. But since I've worked for all of you, none of you would say to me, well, that's a good, prudent fiscal thing to say when you're sitting on, all this money in the bank that you could spend on those projects. So that's where we find ourselves today, and what Travis is offering is a solution that you would then put on the ballot, and the voters would have the chance to say if they agree with or not. So I just wanted to stress a little bit more that we're not shutting City Hall down. We're just going to be coming back to you asking to borrow more money. That's all.
Thank you, Toby. So I wanted to lay out the permanent base adjustment process for you. So basically, tonight, I wanted to share this information with you. You'll take it in, maybe you have some questions, some notes, and then we'll come back next meeting so you can make a determination if you wanted to go forward to the voters and let them decide. And then it'll go, if you say yes, you want the voters to decide, it'll go to the voters. Voters will, they'll cast their ballot and make a decision. And then if it's approved, then you have a permanent base adjustment. And then, like as Toby kind of explained, then we don't have to come to you and ask, hey, can we go out and do a bond, or can we borrow money for these items? Our limit will now align with what our revenues are, our expenses, and our service needs. But I also wanted to share with you, now there is another option, and this isn't the option we're presenting tonight, but I think it's important that you're aware of everything that's out there. There's another option called a home rule adjustment. Now, the home rule adjustment requires you to do 2 hearings, and then the council makes a decision, should it go to the voters? It goes to the voters, voters decide. Now, if the voters do approve it, that goes into effect for 4 years. So you get an adjustment for 4 years, and then you have to bring it back to the voters again and let them decide if they want to keep the adjustment, or if they don't want it and they want it to revert back to that original 1980 base number or 1984 base number. So it's basically a cycle. It just comes back every 4 years, and you have to go through this process. So typically, that particular approach is more so if you have a one-off item or a big project you need kind of some more funding to take care of, and it may not be long-term. For us, we didn't bring that option to you because we feel like our city's growth and where we're at, we need a permanent base adjustment. But again, like I said, we wanted you to be aware of it, so it's so you know what all the options are. I wanted to share this with you. You probably can't see this too well on the screen, but you can see it on your handout, your printouts. This is just all the cities. It's a list of all the cities that have done permanent base adjustments, home rules, or they haven't done anything at all since 1980. Of all the cities, there's 91 cities on this list. 40 have done the home rule, 43 have done the permanent base adjustment, and there's 8 cities remaining who haven't done anything. They're still on their original base figure from 1980. So, and the other thing of note, most of the cities are doing the permanent base adjustment, and I just heard from the League of Cities and Towns that they have some home rule cities that are looking at going to the permanent base adjustment. So not many cities left that haven't done an adjustment. Most of them are smaller and just don't have much development at this time. But we are one of the remaining 8 in that bunch. So here is the proposed limit. As we showed you before, our current limit is at $60,178,831. So what we're proposing, and the way this works is you actually propose you propose an adjustment to the base. So that base number, you ask them to change that, and then it goes to this formula. So as we mentioned before, our base is that 5 million number. We said, okay, we'd like to put a $10 million on top of that, and then it goes to that calculation, and then at the bottom right there, you see what the new adjusted number would be. So Robert did some calculations and looked at this to kind of see what made the most sense. So he'll speak to that in just a moment. But one of the things I want to note is we looked at Kingman and Lake Havasu, who have both, if you saw on the previous list, both have done adjustments, the permanent base adjustments. I think it's been about 2-3 years since they did their adjustments. But both of them are right around that same figure. Right around, I think they did about 9.5 million to their base. So we're really close to what they did, and what their limits are if we do this adjustment. So Robert, you want to give a little detail on that?
Sure. We wanted to look at, in the future and kind of project out the expenses that the city's going. And so I kind of looked at it a few different ways. We looked at if we take our current expenditure of roughly $75 million of the cap plus what we borrowed for this year, and increase about 3% every year, and in 20 years, we'd be at 136 million. If it's a 5% increase, we'll be at this cap limit in 16 years. One of the things we discovered in talking to a handful of other cities all throughout the state that have gone through this process is a lot of them, their biggest regret was not putting their limit up high enough and having to go through this process again several years later. So we wanted to make sure we looked at a number that would fit for the city in the long term. We all know that there's a lot of growth coming to the city, and needing the additional expenditures for roads and utilities and those types of things. We wanted to make sure we gave ourselves enough space with this cap that we wouldn't have to come back to council and to the voters to go through this. We did look at a couple other numbers of adjusting the base to see where that would put us. If we only increased it another 5 million, that put the cap at about 114 million. And as you saw, we're spending, we budgeted about 130 million this year. $7 million increase to the base amount would put it to about 137 million. So we wanted to make sure we gave ourselves enough room for growth that we foresee coming over the next handful of years.
Thank you, Robert. So just a few quick facts to kind of about the PBA. So really, it's about local control of city budget. Again, that limit is set by the state, and they look at things, like I said, inflation, they look at the population growth, but they don't really have the ability to look on the ground and see the things that are going on in relation to how our city's developing, how it's growing from different areas and aspects. So it makes more sense to put this in the hands of the city and also you as in the budget process to make a determination on what should be spent. I think it's important to note that this isn't a tax increase. It's not a new tax in any way, shape, or form. It's just, again, aligning that limit with what our service needs, our capital needs, and then again, putting it in your hands in the budget process. I think it's also important to note that it's not a mechanism for deficit spending. Sometimes people hear that and they think, oh, you want to spend what you don't have. This isn't about that. It's about spending the revenue that we do have in a responsible way. And then deficit spending, that's not even an option because we're not allowed to do that. We're going to always bring you a balanced budget when we come forward. Also, there's a few safeguards I also wanted to mention. What we're already doing, we'll continue to do regardless whether, you say move this forward or not. We're always going to have the annual budget process. Robert and the staff do a fantastic job looking at what the city needs and what its ability is to pay for things. So we'll still go through that process where you get to make that determination. For those large purchases, we still have council reviews for those expenditures. And then as you'll hear more about the annual external audit, we go through that audit process. This is where we're at in relation to our spending and our cap levels is a significant piece of that audit that they look for and make sure we're right where we should be in relation to that. We also have the mandatory reserve balance. So even as Toby mentioned, you know, it seems to make more sense to spend the money you have as opposed to taking out loans. We're not spending into that reserve balance. Robert, what do the mandatory is what, is it 15%?
So the Government Finance Officers Association recommends a minimum 15% reserve, and what that means is your reserves versus your operating expenses. The city, we have it set at 25%, and we're operating around 75%. So we have about 3 times more the required reserves than is on the higher side of the recommended amount.
Yeah, so even if you raise that level, you authorize us to move forward, we're still going to continue with that policy going above and beyond the standard to make sure that the reserve balance is what it should be. And then again, Robert does a great job with doing thorough financial reviews to make sure he's tracking what our spending is, and then also projecting and looking for what's going to be down the road to make sure we have sufficient revenue to cover everything. So just a quick recap. Again, you don't have to decide anything tonight, but it's an information sharing session, opportunity for questions. But we'll come back later down the road, and there's 2 things you're going to need to decide. One, of course, can we move forward to the voters and put this on the ballot and let the voters make a decision? The second item is the when. So when you do this, you got 2 options. You can put it on the ballot for the primary, which will be in July, or you can put it on the ballot for the general election, which will be in November. So you'll determine that now. A couple things that come to mind. With the primary, we have a history of, in our local session, there's no runoffs usually, so a lot of times our voting is would be wrapped up at the primary. There's no guarantee for that, but it could be. So what you're talking about is if you take it to the general, you possibly could be paying for another election or another voting process that might not be necessary to pay for. Now, there's the other side of that coin where some people think more people come out to the general, so you might have more voters, more opportunity for people to express their opinion. So it really is kind of up to you to determine that. We were proposing the primary surely because of the potential cost savings, but that's one of the items that you all will decide at the next meeting. And last slide, I just wanted to give you a quick summary of next steps if you ask us to move this forward. So if you do say that, we'll submit a proposition to the state, and then we'll begin the community education and outreach. We need to submit an analysis to the Auditor General, and that's really for them to look at our figures and make sure everything is accurate and makes sense to what we're proposing. And then we need to submit a public pamphlet to the Auditor General, and the auditor will look that over and make sure everything is as it should be and meets all the requirements. And then Sue will have to have early ballots available on this. And then next, we'll distribute the publicity pamphlets, and then we'll hold the election. And the voters will decide. And then if the voters do choose to say, okay, yes, we support this, we think you should raise that limit, and then we notify the Auditor General, and then it moves forward from there. Now, if it does get raised, unfortunately, it doesn't happen for this coming budget cycle. The timing is just too close, so it would be fiscal year 25-26 if it does get approved. So with that being said, next slide. And that is it for the presentation, and I stand for any questions.